PC Amateur Guy here. Today I want to talk about how to maximize airflow using an AIO, and I'm going to use this as an example first. Of course, you never want to go against the way air naturally flows. So if it's flowing up, you want to exhaust the fans out. Originally, like when I had this IO, some cases don't allow you to, it's not easily to place the fan where you want to place it. Sometimes you have to place the radiator first. But if you take a look at this, you can see there's already a fan up here, and it's for exhausting air out. It's kind of like cool air, but a little bit warm actually. But the point is, if you're going to exhaust the air out and then you have a rad, that's not really maximization. If your case can afford it, you always want to put, you can put a second fan and then have that intake, right? So essentially this will intake and then cool the rad here and then exhaust it out. That's, yeah. And then another thing you can do is if you put your hand over it and if you feel like this hot air there, then honestly it's basically an issue because you're pulling hot air out of the case, right? So if it's like warm or cool, then you know your setup is working. So that's one of the ways you would know. And I'm gonna go to another case and give you another example. This is the Hyte Revolt 3, and let me just open it up and I'm gonna show you common issue or common situation where you're gonna run into. So like even the next N1 case, you're gonna run into this issue whenever there's a AIO that you can put in. And what that is you have a situation where, again, sometimes you can't put your radiator on the front, so you can only put your fans, right? So the question is, do you exhaust or do you intake? And that comes up a lot. And you know, Gamers Nexus mentioned this, Vancouver Canucks mentioned this in their videos. Essentially, if you're pulling cool air, or if you're pulling air into the case, the graphics card is going to suffer. Okay, so a lot of times you're going to run into the question, should these fans be intake or should they be exhaust, right? Because you don't want your graphics card to suffer. But the thing is that if it's exhaust, your CPU is going to suffer. So you're kind of in this dilemma where you say, well, should my CPU suffer or should my graphics card suffer, right? So again, if it's that's the question that you're facing. So I want to answer that question. So the answer is, should you let your CPU suffer or should you let your graphics card suffer? And this is a really, this is a big question, because the issue is whenever you have a small ITX case or small cases, you don't have a lot of airflow. So essentially the other components are in there, it's basically suffocating, right? So the answer is you actually want to have the fans facing the radiator as much as possible. So if, in other words, if you can have your fans inside and your rad out, you want to have the fans obviously intake into the rad so that the air is actually being pulled out. But what that means is essentially in this situation specifically, you want it to be intake. Okay, and let me explain why. If you have these fans intake, essentially what's happening is your radiator would be cooler because you're pulling cool air from the outside. So this is actually optimized for this specific height case. You want it to be actually intake here because you're pulling, the air has to come from somewhere, right? But if the air is coming outside, you're actually intaking it into the radiator, and that's going to obviously keep the radiator cool and in turn keep the CPU cool. And now the question is, well, does that mean my graphics card is going to suffer? No, not necessarily, because if your CPU, remember, it's an ecosystem, right? So if your CPU is cooler, and that means your motherboard essentially will be cooler too, right? Because they're all interconnected, and they're going to relate each other, and then that's also going to keep the power supply a lot cooler because you're not heating up the other internal components. So it's like kind of like a dominoes effect. If one is hot, the other components are hot, and so it's a circular issue. So what you want to do is you want to focus on keeping one component cool, and then focus on the second component, and then you'll be good. So the first component is always a situation when you're facing how do you maximize airflow for AIO. You want to pace the fans so that the radiator will be the coolest situation possible. So in this situation, you're pulling cool air from the outside, and you're going to be cool the rad, which in turn will cool the CPU, which in turn will keep the motherboard and the VRM a lot cooler. And therefore, the power supply won't be as hot, and therefore the fans don't need to rev up. And then that's basically the answer. Now, the other half of the question is, well, what about my graphics card? Because if you're telling me if my CPU is cooler, doesn't that, if I'm pulling air in, doesn't that affect my graphics card? And the answer is actually no. Well, why no? Because the ecosystem is, like I said earlier, you want to make sure that all the components are cool as possible. Then it will affect each other's parts. So that means that your motherboard, your CPU, your radiator is cooler, and then therefore the cooler air can actually transfer over to the graphics card because the entire case is overall cooler, right? But then what happens if my graphics card gets hotter? Doesn't that, put hot air into the case? Because this is obviously like intake, right? These fans here are intake. So let me just so when I take this out, this is going to be like intake, right? And essentially what's going to happen actually is this graphics card is actually going to intake cool air because it's coming from the outside. So that's going to actually pull in cool air, and then that will keep the graphics card cooler. So that's the answer. Another thing you could do is, as I mentioned in my other video, you want to get the biggest graphics card that you could fit in your smallest case. Because the bigger the graphics card is, it has a bigger passive cooler, and the fans don't actually even need to come on. But essentially, what that means is that with a bigger cooler, passive cooler built into your graphics card will also be cooler. So again, the ecosystem, one component affects the other, becomes a circular problem. So to maximize, you want to try to keep all your components as cool as possible. So if the question comes up, well, if I put this as intake, does that mean my graphics card is going to be suffering? No, because I just proved it to you that if your rad is cooler, your motherboard will be cooler, your CPU will be cooler, and then essentially your graphics card will also be cooler, because it's all an ecosystem that affects all the entire parts. And if you get a graphics card with a big passive cooler, then the graphics card will also be cooler, and then it won't actually create heat to affect the other components, right? So that's the answer. So I hope that this helps somebody. But again, in summary, in conclusion, if you're ever facing a question if your radiator should be intake or exhaust, how is that going to affect my system? You have to look at the overall system, and the answer would be you want to keep the CPU as cool as possible, because if the CPU is cool as possible, all the other components, the motherboard, the VRM, will also be cool. And so that's your answer. So there's no one answer. It just depends on the flow of your case, and depends on how you can, whether the radiator comes from the outside, whether it comes from the inside. You want to have a situation where you can ensure that the radiator would be as cool as possible. And you also try to remember, whenever you're pulling air in from the outside, it would be a lot cooler. Whereas if these rads were exhaust, right? If these rads were exhaust, essentially what that means is you're actually putting hot air in your system, in your computer, right? And then it's gonna obviously heat up the VRM or heat up the power supply or heat up the graphics card, because you're throwing hot air into the system, because the air has to come from somewhere, as I mentioned in my other video. So what that means is if you're exhausting these fans, you're not maximizing the airflow for AIO, because you're actually putting hot air into your system. And essentially, if your CPU is hotter, then therefore all the other components will be harder, and essentially your graphics card would be harder as well, because it's essentially also attached to the motherboard, right? So yeah, so I hope this video helps. By the way, I also have an exhaust fan up there, and so you don't want to obviously be intake for this, because if you have intake, you're pulling, you're going against natural airflow, and you want to pull air out, and you're going to see that just putting a couple exhaust fans up here it will help with your graphics card because it's going to pull the heat out. It's going to pull the hot air out, right? So that's also good. You can fit two 80mm fans on top here, by the way, but it has to be 10 centimeters in thickness, not 50mm, obviously not 25. It has to be 10 centimeters, otherwise it will be touching on these. There's like an internal pole here that allows you to close the case. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Okay, thanks for watching, and see you in my next video.